Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we dig in deep to analyze the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, 1 minute at a time. I'm Andy Nelson from thenextreel.com.
And I'm Pete Wright, also from The Next Reel.
We are looking at Jon Favreau's 2008 film Iron Man. And back with us again today, we have Dr. Arnold Blumberg from the Marvel Cinematic Universe Review Podcast. Welcome back, Arnold.
Hello again.
We are looking at minute 69 from Iron Man. On today's show, the minute starts with Obadiah's interview getting interrupted by Tony's arrival, and it ends with Agent Coulson letting Tony know that they need to debrief him.
Pretty much nothing matters in this minute until 10 seconds in.
Just more Jeff Bridges excellence in the first part.
He set the bar high and then.
Yeah, Jeff Bridges, Tony Stark, but really, as you're alluding to, Pete, we get the fantastic Stan Lee cameo. This is our minute with good old Stan Lee.
This is, so he doesn't, I've totally forgotten this. He doesn't even get a line.
No.
Well, he has a line in the script, and apparently they shot it. In the script, he turns around while Tony's still there. Tony sees him and goes like, "Oh, sorry, wrong guy." And then Lee says, "That's okay. I get that all the time." And that was the cameo. And then I mean, obviously they didn't edit that down to create this one because Tony just keeps on walking.
Yeah.
So they just shot it a couple different ways and went with this one. But there's something really funny about just seeing him turn, and he definitely has that Hugh Hefner look.
I think it does work comically more that he doesn't say anything. But I guess at the time, too, what's interesting about it has now become this enshrined thing. Stan will appear in every film. And, of course, now we're facing a world where I suspect, well, there have been some that have been shot, and there are ways that I'm sure they'll find a way to keep his presence felt. But at this point, we had no idea that was going to become a thing, although I think most of us could have predicted it. But just the idea that he's there at all was amazing. Just to see him and say, "Oh, isn't that nice? It's Stan." Could never imagine that eventually it would build to a point where he gets to have usually a good comic beat. He gets a great line. And so this is like the beginning of all that.
It's the beginning of all that. And I think what's fascinating is it actually takes Stan Lee's sort of personality and makes him so much more famous because it expands him to an audience that he never would have touched, right? The cinematic audience, people who never knew the comics wouldn't have known Stan Lee or Kirby from any other Joe on the street. And it makes Stan Lee a personality in a totally new way at the very end of his life and career. I think that's just amazing.
And some people like I grew up with him, with hearing him. I mean, I knew his name from the comics and stuff, but I grew up hearing him as kind of the voiceover, the narrator for like Spider-Man and Friends and things like that. And that was my introduction to kind of hearing him and always feeling welcomed by him and everything, and having him just do these cameos, I think was just such a great way to just kind of continue that friendly presence that I always felt.
Well, and Andy, to your point exactly, like that's the thing that makes me sort of sad that he doesn't get a line here, because I think that sort of cements that connection between the voice that we grew up hearing in Spider-Man and Friends and beyond, and this guy dressed like Hugh Hefner. Like when you don't hear him talk, only those who are really in the know will get it.
And it's interesting though that that this moment, it's fleeting, but the camera stops and spends the time to linger on him. It assumes a knowledge on the part of the audience that certainly couldn't have been all pervasive at that point. And like you were saying about like lending him an additional level of celebrity, there would be tons of people going to see this movie that wouldn't recognize him, and yet the movie seems to behave as if this is a big deal, which it is. And it's like, so anybody that didn't know would at least be getting the feeling, oh, am I supposed to recognize him? And it's interesting how much importance they're giving him in that moment. And it's really cool.
He actually started doing his appearances in little cameos in the TV movie, The Trial of the Incredible Hulk.
That's right.
The Jerry Foreman back in 1989. And then he had a few little appearances here and there, and then a lot of appearances in non-Marvel properties. Even in Blade, actually, in 98, he had an appearance, but it ended up getting cut.
Mm-hmm.
But then
he's in X-Men, too.
Yeah, starting with X-Men back in 2000, and then Spider-Man 2002, Daredevil 2003, and Hulk. It just really kind of spirals from there, and it became a regular thing in I'm pretty sure every Marvel property after that, at least the films. TV shows, maybe an episode here and there, certainly not every episode, but it's something that became a thing. And Hitchcock back in the day, it became kind of a fun thing for people who, as they started realizing who he was, of kind of finding him. And my kids love it now when they see him and go, oh, there he is. And, I love that they do that now. It's a great little thing to kind of help connect it for the kids and just give it that extra level of meta enjoyment.
Well, and I just can't help but connect it, when to this moment and we just saw Spider-Man again in the theater. We wanted to catch it before it left. And the moment of seeing Stan as a cartoon, as an animated version of himself, it's just, now I'm sitting there with my daughter and we're just like choking up because, that this is kind of the transition to the movies without Stan, even though I think we have one more.
I think he shot through the end of Endgame, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's still like, this is the beginning of the end of the Stan Easter eggs. And now, a decade later, those mean something, much, much more than they did. And it all started right here.
There's what I think is a really interesting connection to him and particular Iron Man and Tony Stark. In the TV series Avengers Assemble, he actually provided the voice of Tony Stark. He played future Tony Stark in 3 episodes, which I think is a really funny and surprising character that I didn't expect to see on his roster.
That's awesome.
That's very cool.
But Hugh Hefner, Stan Lee does have. He does have several women on his arms there. He's got Lana Kinnear, Nicole Lindeblad, and Masha Lund. Well, actually, there's credited 4 women as Stan's girls. The other is Gabrielle, Tuite. And looking at them and trying to pinpoint who they are, I actually think Nicole is the one that asks Tony if he remembers her when he says, "Sure don't." Mm-hmm. I think that's Nicole, and I think the other 3 are the ones who are with Stan. Again, it's just a nice thing to perhaps, maybe nowadays we're like, I don't know how well that plays, but in context of creating this faux Hugh Hefner character, it actually works pretty well.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So this is we get this nice moment here with Obadiah and Tony as Obadiah is surprised. And you get that look on his face. He's not expecting to see Tony. He's told Tony to, keep a low profile, stay out of the spotlight, because the last time that they were in the spotlight together, Tony told everybody that they're no longer manufacturing weapons. And now here they are with a camera pointed directly at them as they have this brief little exchange. It's, I try to get a sense of, as we play through the scenes with Obadiah, in the initial creation of the script, the idea was to have, my understanding is Obadiah was going to be a character, but not necessarily the antagonist of the film. Perhaps they were saving him to be an antagonist for later films. The idea, I think, at the time was still to have the Crimson Dynamo, or perhaps the Mandarin himself, as the villain. And so I always wonder, with scenes like this, did they know yet that Stain was going to be the villain, or was this still a point where it's like, it still is the Crimson Dynamo. We're just kind of giving Stain this vibe. What do you guys think?
I think, for one thing, it's a credit to Jeff Bridges' performance. I know I've already made it clear how much I love him in this movie particularly, but I think it's a credit to him that the relationship he builds with Downey's Tony Stark feels so real, and yet there isn't anything. I mean, it's suitably shocking when it needs to be, but also simultaneously, it doesn't feel unnatural or at all surprising that he could be the villain and that he could be against him. it feels equally organic if he hadn't been than the fact that he has. And I think it's just that he's great at creating that character, and he seems to be someone that has genuine emotional connection to Tony. And so it also makes it all the more realistic to find out why he's motivated the way he is. And it kind of works that whether he knew or didn't at any point in the production, it's almost like it doesn't matter. In fact, it may even have been better, if that was a little vague, because it may have made that performance a little more natural. And then when that turn happens, it still feels very right.
I think Jeff Bridges is the lenticular postcard of performances here. When you watch it the first time, that shot when he turns around at like 37, 38 seconds and says, "Look at you." It looks like he's genuinely surprised in kind of a PR moment that Tony is up and healthy and out of his garage. When you watch it a second time, to me, that reads totally sinister. He absolutely knows that he was trying to get rid of Tony and things are moving, in a new direction, and that this is going to be ultimately trouble for him. And I think, having the gift of rewatchability is one of the great strengths of Bridges in this movie.
I don't think they've had very many other villains. I don't subscribe, by the way, to the constant railing against the Marvel movies villain problem. I don't think it's quite as all pervasive as people tend to make it out to be. I think it's a case by case thing. But I do.
Would you before you do outline the Marvel movie villain problem?
Oh, sure. Well, in general, it seems it's become one of the standard beats for a lot of people writing critiques, whether they're on the side of genuinely liking the movies or whether they're just trashing them, is this idea that Marvel has a villain problem, that somehow the villains in the Marvel movies are somewhat perfunctory, that they don't really come across as full characters, that their motivations are either vague or too pat. Depending on who's writing about it, the circumstances can be a little different. But basically the idea being their villains are terrible and they're not nuanced enough and not complex enough. One thing we did talk about in one of the minutes I've shared with you so far is that it is true that Marvel tends to be a bit repetitive in some of their general themes, and that speaks to the villain problem a little bit. So I agree that sometimes the movies are a bit repetitive and relying too much on father-son stories as an underpinning. So that part I think is true. But I still feel that very often they've had characters that serve the purpose of whatever story is being told in a way that's usually pretty good, if not excellent. But I do think that Bridges' performance in this, I don't think they've had many other villains in the whole history of this series so far that can match his performance in this first movie. As a character that feels like the kind of villain you can almost understand and empathize with on a certain level. I think Vincent D'Onofrio in Daredevil is one of the gold standards for that. And it's telling that didn't happen in a movie.
Right.
Great example, that one. Jeff Bridges is just great with the subtext. And that, I think, speaks to Pete's comments earlier and about how you can read it so many different ways. What is it that he's thinking? Is it just the business side of things? Is there something else going on? Certainly in retrospect, after you've seen the film, you can read a lot more into these looks. But without having seen the film before, and I had not been a comic book reader before I saw this movie, I didn't know that if I knew the name Stain was involved, I would have instantly known that, oh, well, he's a villain in the comics, but I didn't know that. And so I walked into this going, oh, it's Jeff Bridges. He's Jeff Bridges. He's a great character. And here he's kind of this tough businessman, but you don't necessarily get the sense that he's a villain, especially the way they're setting up Raza, as we've been talking about. So we go from this scene and we go inside the concert hall, and now we're in a beautifully lit room that feels like it was, I don't know if it always looks this way or if it just was lit this way because it has a nice blend of kind of the gold and red that feels like Iron Man, like we're inside the suit weirdly.
It's all Tony's world. We're just living in it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We go with Tony up to the bar, and of course we've got Agent Coulson conveniently standing right there next to the flowers, and it's a nice little moment for Tony as he gets to chat with Agent Coulson here.
Oh, Clark Gregg is just so wonderful. This movie is just filled with incredibly great performances, and also here's a character that is so desperately important to the entire future of this extended franchise, is to create a character who will serve as the actual connective tissue that will make this whole world fit together and ultimately like drive so much of like the first big emotional climactic peak of this whole series. And he's just so damn lovable. And it's like, what an amazing stroke of genius to have somebody play a government agent that doesn't instantly make us suspicious. He's so pleasant. I mean, you look at this shot and it's like the bar is underlit and, they're a little bit underlit, and you could almost argue there's a bit of a sinister aspect because you don't know who this guy is. You don't know what's going on. Although if you're a fan, as soon as you hear who he works for, it's like, well, we know where this is going. But he's just so nice that you can't help but think, well, this is a good guy. And the fact that he is just a good guy is so important.
And they play it, it's funny how they play it for laughs so often through the first part of this film. Because every time he's been reaching out, one, the acronym is very unwieldy, and they always make jokes about it, which I think is great. But two, it's always about these meetings, and Pepper keeps putting him off, and Tony obviously is getting the message that this agent wants to debrief him because he knows who he is. He vaguely remembers the name of the organization. But he still is kind of putting him off, and I just think it's funny that it's this little thing that he just kind of keeps popping up as that comic character who's always just like, oh, excuse me, but never quite gets the response that he's looking for, and it ends up working really nicely, especially later in the film. But here, it's just this nice beat that ends up creating this additional moment of levity, which I think works really nicely.
I also think that one of the things that's interesting about, well, again, like Clark Gregg is just the lovability of Coulson is that, and I've often talked about and taught elsewhere in my class about stuff like Tony Stark being this extraordinary choice to start the series off, that on the one hand, you could say there's so many things about that character you wouldn't automatically think, well, let's start with an audience identification character who is a wealthy, out-of-touch arms dealer who doesn't, really understand his own emotional being. And yet, that's how that works because we see him rebuild himself in this first film, and that brings the audience in. But in many respects, it's Coulson who is the emotional connection for the audience. First, he's this lovable character who provides these moments of lightness. And then as you start to see this character is going to keep threading through, he builds such goodwill with the audience that's like we grow to be so happy every time you say, oh, here's Coulson again. And that becomes so important. So in some respect, he's a major key to why this series starts off strong and develops the connection with a movie-going audience that it did.
And the fact that we take this nebbishy federal agent and make him a guy that you are absolutely emotionally bowled over by as the arc of his character continues in the cinematic universe, recognizing that I probably haven't seen those, because of our own internal rule set. I think that is a magical thing that they did with this character. This character who is nothing more than sort of an annoyance in this movie becomes something so grand.
Well, and even in this movie, we don't know this for sure, but there will be a chance for growth, and that's something I think that's important with storytelling and screenwriting, is allowing not just for your main character to have that character arc, but to allow other characters to also have some character arcs and get to see them grow and change over the course of the film, and seeing this character become more important later, I think, is a real strength. And obviously it came largely because of the casting of Clark Gregg, because he was so great. And they thought that, man, this guy is so good, we have to put more of him in here. And lucky for us, it worked out that way.
Absolutely.
The inside of the, I don't know, I'm going, since now we're inside, I'm looking at images of the inside. The inside of the building, is that really the Disney, like a lobby around the Disney concert hall? Do you know?
Or is that like a set? Yeah.
My understanding is they actually filmed it here. Yeah. My understanding is they filmed all of these scenes here.
Okay, so one of the things that is just a weird coincidental aside, my kids are now old enough to watch Glee. When it was on, the show was not something that my kids were old enough to watch. So we're doing sort of a family run through of Glee, and we're in the weird sort of Cousin Oliver season when all the original kids have grown up and left, and so they replace them with young kids, high school kids again, supposedly, but they screw up and they send the original kids to New York, and the Whoopi Goldberg storyline in that season, she runs this supposed theater at the New York Academy of Dramatic Arts, and all of the performing takes place in this room, which is crazy that it would come up in that sort of weird little season of that show. And also here, I had no memory of it, but it is such an iconic location that it's hard to miss.
By the way, I also wanted to just point out this one of the little things while I'm looking at the interiors too. One of those nice little touches that's not as big or flashy as like a big set piece or like a big sign design, but just keeps world building, is starting around 38 seconds. Like when Tony comes to the bar, behind the bartender guy, just a real tiny type on the wall, it says "Gift to the Stark Foundation." And that, his money's in this too. And of course it's his, it's his benefit and everything. It's just like the little touches, like they didn't even need to bother putting that on the wall, but they did. And it makes it feel real.
It's funny that you point that out because, I definitely appreciate that too. But I can't stop looking at the bartender's reaction when Tony orders his drink. He says, give me a scotch, I'm starving, or whatever he says. But the bartender gives him this weird, it's almost like a weird, why not shrug. It's just such a strange reaction to Tony.
He's trying to pat his part there a little bit, maybe.
Well, it looks like this is the exact yang to Jeff Bridges' yin when he's comforting the extra who's going to be working with him, saying, "Don't worry, man, it's going to be okay." And this is like this guy being intimidated by Robert Downey Jr., and Robert does nothing to make this guy feel at ease. He's just like, nope. So this is that nervous reaction that he's giving there.
He would be more like, come on, dude, man up. We got to shoot this thing. I got a party to get to.
I don't think I have anything else for this minute. What about you guys?
That's it for me.
No, it's it for me too.
All right. Well, Arnold, we got one more minute tomorrow, but before we jump into that one, thanks for joining us again today.
It's a pleasure.
Do you want to remind everybody where they can find you out online?
You can track me down on Twitter at Doctor of the Dead, and you can find my publishing company where we do titles on all sorts of pop culture things you love, like zombies and superheroes and television shows of all kinds at atbpublishing.com.
All right, everybody. Well, that is it for today's show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the show for free at marvelmovieminute.com. Join us over in our Discord chat room and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Next Reel. And if you like what we do and you want to support us and get some cool stuff, become a patron over at patreon.com/thenextreel. Until next time, true believers.